Hey everybody, welcome to episode 19 already. I've only been out about a couple months and we're already episode 19. And this episode of the Mosaic podcast is one of the episodes I've been extremely excited to do. I've tried to get Beau on the show for a little bit of time. We've had a couple of scheduling conflicts because he's so in pursuit of people want him everywhere. We spoke and he's been in India. You tell us where you've been just in the last few weeks.
Well, I was in Iceland, London, India, San Francisco, Seattle, New York. I probably missed something in there.
Okay, and I'm sure that's where every listener has been also. So one of the reasons I've been so excited, and we've just moved it around a little bit, but I love what this man is doing because everything about the Mosaic and the book that I wrote turns out to be that the way we perceive the world is really just that. What we see in the world is what we see in the world. It's not what the world is. It's merely a perception. And our perception is only 1 degree of the 360. So the other 359, we really don't see very much. So I don't know if that's what Beau will agree to or not, but let me give you a little bit of background. He's the founder of the Lab of Misfits, which, by the way, I love that company name.
I'd like to know why you love it.
I just think it's so cool. I think a lab is experiential. I think Misfits is what most people are. We don't want to admit it sometimes, but we really don't fit into the world. None of us fit in. Our personas.
I think everyone feels a misfit, personally.
Yeah. But yet we silo ourselves in and put walls around ourselves to try and fit in when the beauty of who we are is a lab of misfits. And so that's why I'm just a complete harmony with it. And what he calls it is, and listen to some of these terms, it's the world's first neuro-designed studio. Like we're going to talk about what the heck that is. But the lab creates unique experiential experiments that place the public at the center of the process of discovery. And by spanning social and personal boundaries between people, brands, and institutions, their aim at the Lab of Misfits is to create insights into what it is to be human. Misfits gives the audience and brands the opportunity to see not only to see differently, but to embody that understanding. Beau's given 2 TED Talks. He's worked with companies like Google and BBC, Horizon, National Geographic, and the PBS. And he's a man he's a neuroscientist who's fascinated with the human perception. He teaches that the senses deliver data to the brain, and it's the brain that assembles that data into information that is meaningful to the human being. As he puts it, we never see the world as it actually is, but only the world that's useful for us to see. He's also the founder of Lotto Lab, a cross between an art studio and a science lab where the public interacts with striking sculptures and illusions, and from where he mines data of his studies in human perception. His passion shows itself in his unorthodox, interactive approach to research. And he uses art and performance as a mass experiment to teach people that what they perceive as unbiased reality is actually a neurologically produced response to data, grounded in a personal and biological history. I could go on, but I want you to get a chance to talk. I want to get people to hear you. What an honor to have you with us, and thank you so much for taking time out from the busyness of your life and your schedule to be on the Mosaic podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I love the word. I love the name, by the way, Mosaic.
Yeah.
I love the concept of mosaics.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful, simple, easy to get concept because we're all made up of so much more than we perceive. Mm-hmm. And so many people think that they're broken. And they go back to times when they thought they were whole, and they try and relive those moments, when in reality, it's this part of them that's evolved from all those different forms that allows them to be part of a greater reality. And we know by all that's happening in the world today that collectively we're so much more powerful than we are individually. And it would make beautiful art probably to take a vase and a frame and a plate and make a mosaic out of that. It would be interesting to look at. But the mosaic that we see most of the time is what people think of as broken pieces, but we're not broken at all. We're just part of a new artistry. It's part of a new paradigm, and that's really what I'm interested in developing. A new paradigm that brings all of us together into the oneness of what we really are.
Absolutely. In fact, I actually just did a third TED Talk on that concept itself.
Wow.
And the perception of that and how it feels when we have that perception. And we call that, we have a name for that perception, which is awe, the perception of awe. When you feel small but fundamentally connected to the world around you.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, so that's why I feel like I know you. I feel like you've been around. I feel like we've been in the same circles, but we haven't. But I just like the ideas that we have are universal, and it's time for them to come. And it feels beautiful for that.
Why? I can say I can agree with that, but actually take no credit for that, because when I do my talks or whenever someone says, "Oh, I really enjoy what you said," and I say, "Well, actually, it's because you already know it to be true."
Yes.
And because we're talking about biology, and so our work is very much sort of philosophy grounded in biology, and the beauty of that, I think, is that it can also help shift arguments as well.
1,000,000,000%.
Not just neuroscience, but in biology in general, i.e. the study of life. And of course, we are a function of that life, of that biology. So what we're talking about, and it's not just me, many people are talking about, we know to be true because we are living evidence of it.
I love that. And you see it now more than ever. And the need for it is coming to a place now more than ever, where we are living in the most connected time we've ever known. And in some ways, we're more divided than we've ever been.
Well, yes, that's very true. And I think that the consequence of that increased connectivity is, well, everything's contextual. So it's the nature of the connectivity, first of all, and its intention. And unfortunately, a lot of that, not all of it, of course, some of it, much of it is, of course, tremendously positively powerful. But too much of it isn't, and too much of it is in the service of something else. And so, for instance, I consider something like, we evolved to be social, right? You died if you weren't. To be social is not a choice. It's inherent in our brain, and it's not just us, other living systems, of course. So this concept of being independent is a silly idea, because everyone is dependent on everyone else. So one's behavior affects someone else's.
But pause for a minute, if you don't mind, because at least in America, we've grown up to feel like we have to be independent, that we have to be strong, that even though we hear no man's an island, we believe we're an island. And we go about it. We've been in a competitive world where science really led that by the survival of the fittest of Darwin. That we believe that we have to survive, and in order to survive, we have to conquer, and we have to stand alone. And this whole idea of a cooperative reality that we're coming into now is so much more true.
Well, the cooperative reality, of course, was always there. Cooperative reality is not a new thing, and there is a sort of I don't know if it's a conflict, but at least a movement between a cooperative and an individualistic. But often the value of an individualistic as opposed to the cooperative, and especially now with this hyperconnectivity, especially when it's in the service of something else other than actually facilitating growth, is that if something now happens on the other side of the world, I now feel it. It affects me almost instantaneously. If the stock market in Japan goes down, it affects everywhere else in the world. So we're increasingly in less control of our fates. Now, in some sense, we've never been in control of our fates, because we're, of course, subject to the people around us, our immediate community, our weather, the environment. But now we're affected by so many things further afield. And so you could argue that a great deal of that individualism, or what's happening now with the nationalism or Brexit, for instance, in Europe, where I was living for 25 years, is an attempt to actually break those connections, to actually increase the sense of control. And the principal reason I would argue for that is because what we hate more than anything, what the brain hates more than anything, or at least among many things, but one of our greatest fears is not knowing.
Mm-hmm.
We hate uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And almost every one of our behaviors is an attempt to decrease uncertainty.
Yeah, because we love control.
We love control. And the question is, why do we love control? And I would suggest that one of the reasons why we love control is because dying is easy, right? If you could, during evolution, if you couldn't predict, you died. So to be in uncertainty was a bad thing to be. It means you weren't sure what was going to happen. I mean, imagine if you had, life is so much easier than it was then, obviously. So if you had your shelter, you had everything around you, you had your food, what a stupid idea in a way to see what's on the other side of the hill, because you've actually increased the chance of dying.
Yeah.
Right?
And when Maslow's sort of arc goes, that a certain level of uncertainty is what we need to bring life to passion, to give life reality.
Exactly. So that's the irony, right? Because you can never adapt. So my lab and myself, what we're particularly interested, I'm a neuroscientist, but what I'm particularly interested in is adaptive systems, how things change with experience, how things change as a consequence of interaction. And you can't change in many senses if you don't shift from where you are.
Totally.
And to shift from where you are is to go into the unknown.
Totally.
So that's the irony, that if you don't adapt, you die, right?
Totally.
That's one of the phrases we have is adapt or die.
Yeah.
And if you don't adapt, you're selected out. But to do that requires going to the very place that we actually evolved to avoid. So we have this dichotomy. The one, almost every one of my behaviors is an attempt to decrease uncertainty, and yet, unless I don't know from time to time, I'm going to be selected out.
Yeah, because when you think about it, certainty means if we really love certainty that much, we would watch the same movie every time we put on the television, because we know exactly what's going to happen. But after a certain amount of time of doing that, it gets boring. And
yet, look at our environment. People walk to work, same side of the road.
We love it.
Same paths, because we are creating an environment that is predictable. We elect leaders that become almost totalitarian, because we will then be told what to do. There's safety in that sense, and yet we lose freedom as a consequence.
And we become more unsafe than ever, because we lose the ability to be individual, to understand, to have a contribution, to play a part. And so all that I love. Let's subset for a minute, because we're already got our gloves on and gone in and playing, right? I want to backtrack if I could. And what did you want to be when you were a kid?
What did I want to be when I was a kid? A kid, probably.
I love that answer, by the way. Nobody's ever said that to me.
And maybe there wasn't always the opportunity to be a kid. So that was probably one of the things, was just to be a kid. Now, beyond that, and I think which is related to being a kid, was I don't know. I wanted to be an inventor, is what I probably wanted to be. And
how, out of all the things that you could have possibly been, did you think that you wanted to be an inventor? Because you haven't strayed far from what your two things, the little bit that I know about you and the empathic things that I feel from you, you still are a kid in some ways. And you are an inventor. You're creating new systems of doing things. You're finding new ways of. So how, out of all the things that were possible, did you say, I want to be an inventor? That's a small subset of what most kids would probably say.
I suppose it's thinking about what the concept of an inventor is. So what does the concept of an inventor encapsulate? I think it's the creation of something that doesn't exist yet.
Love it.
That creation of something that doesn't exist yet could be an idea. It could be an actual object that comes into the world, and we do make objects. I have a tech company as well, an augmented reality tech company, so we actually invent stuff in that sense. But it can also be the creation of a feeling in someone else. If someone's unhappy, you can invent, in some sense, invent in them a feeling of compassion as well.
So that's, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's why I would if to think about it now, in some sense, I think that is to be able to bring into the world something that didn't exist before. But of course, that by itself is not novel. You don't do that in isolation, because of course we're fundamentally interdependent. No one does that in isolation, but maybe the uniqueness is in the context in which you bring things together.
Are you old enough to remember overhead projectors?
Yeah, I'm 51.
Okay, so those existed in your time. For people who don't know what they are, they're these machines that you put plastic slabs on that has a light, and it broadcasts up above in front of the room what's going on. If you would take now the overhead projector, if you would imagine putting 2 pieces of plastic paper on the overhead projector, I would like you to put on the first sheet what we were talking about as we opened up, this need to maintain certainty, to not have certainty at all, to overplay what we know, because the unfamiliar, why would we ever leave our house if we have everything that we want? Yeah. And then I would love for you now to put on that other sheet, which is that part of you that is that wanted to be a creator, that wanted to be an inventor, that would create things that didn't exist. And I want you to tell me where you are with that, what now shows up in the image of you in front of a person who does everything he can to maintain the status quo, or what we know, and yet has built something that is innovative and creates things that nobody's ever seen before, or feelings that nobody's ever felt before, or perceptions nobody's ever realized before.
Yes.
How do those play together?
Within myself or in the world?
Well, both.
Within myself, I'm not sure they exist within myself that much, in the sense that I for better or for worse, tend to disrupt myself. Which is not always a good thing, by the way.
You're talking to someone who does the same thing, so I want to second that.
Often it's not, actually. The hope is that, well, it might not be so good for you. Hopefully you don't project that cost onto other people, and you pay the price of your own and take ownership of that. And for all those moments that I hadn't, I apologize. But those that I know about. But of course, like anyone else, I love certainty. I mean, of course, I'm just no reason why I wouldn't. I very much love certainty. What I think how you bring those two together is, and how, and I have this question in general about people who create. And by creation, I think it's actually an interesting topic about thinking about what one creates, because you can make many things. But are some things, I don't want to say more interesting than others, but where do we get true insight when we create? But where you resolve that is in closure. I think what I love more than anything is closure. And I think that's what the brain loves. And musicians use this all the time. So, next time you go to a nightclub, right? Right? And the DJ's ramping up the music, right? And he or she is ramping it up, and you can feel it building. Of course, your dopamine's going up there, because what he's building or she's building is anticipation. And we have tremendous pleasure in that anticipation, as long as we have the possibility that it's going to resolve. So they ramp it up, and everyone's holding, and then suddenly the music drops. And everybody's body just starts moving forward and really feeling the rhythm. And that's because we love closure, right? Mozart, before he would go to bed, someone once told me this story, that he would go to the piano and go da-da-da-da-da. And his father, who was already in bed, said, "Oh God!" He'd have to get out of bed and hit the final note of the scale before he'd go back to bed. Right? We love closure, So maybe what it is when you're disrupting, when you're creating uncertainty, I think about it more as a spiral. You start from a place where you know, and at that point you feel like you know a lot. In fact, of course, you know very little, but you feel as if you know a lot. And if you ask someone, what do you know now that you know you're not going to know in the future?
Love it.
No one can answer that question.
Love it. Love it.
And so then you step out and you go out and you step into uncertainty, and then you come back again. And it's that coming back and getting that closure that I think is how you resolve the need for certainty. On the bell. I thought I've turned everything off, but it turns
That's okay. It's okay to have all sorts of uncertainty happening. That's where we're at right now.
Forget it. Anyway, so that's how you resolve them.
So if you look at human existence, it's sort of interesting from the psychology aspect of it. We grow up, and I've got kids now who are 15 and 16 years old.
Same as mine.
Okay, and they believe they know everything. Yeah. Right. And when we say to them, gosh, wait till that point in time where you grow up a little bit, where you realize how little, as much as you know nothing, they look at you like, well, what are you talking about? Like, what's going on? But I used to think I knew everything too. Right. And yet life takes us through a series of incidences where we realize how little we know. So we go from that certainty to that uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, to me, I call it ultimate emptiness. In that ultimate emptiness, life allows us by its very nature to be refilled, because we can't put any more into a jug that's already filled. Mm-hmm. And so I just am interested, because for someone who says they love certainty as much as you say you do, your whole life is about putting people in uncertainty.
Yes, but not just for the sake of it, first of all, but also in a certain kind of context. Because there's also a context in which we actually love uncertainty.
Yeah, it's exciting.
It's not every context that we love that we crave certainty. And so your listeners can think about the time, or viewers, they can think about the time or times when, or what is the one human behavior, it's not just human, what is the one behavior where they actually love uncertainty? And there's a word for it. And that word is actually called science.
Science.
That's a weird thing for me to say. Well, maybe it's useful for me to say because I'm a scientist. But if you think about what science is, as far as I'm concerned, is not defined by the methodology of science. That's the craft of science. It's a beautiful craft, right? Some people are brilliant. I find an experiment that's elegantly designed is beautiful, right? To me, it's an aesthetic.
Yeah.
But that's not what captures science. It'd be like defining or reducing painting or a piece of art, a painting to pigment chemistry or to the brushstrokes. No, it's a way of being. Science is a way of being. And what is that way of being? It's play. It's play with intention, right? And play evolved for a reason. Play evolved because it's that very space, it's that mental space that enables you to go to the very place we evolved to avoid, which is to not know. So think about when you're watching, American football game, or my preference is soccer, right? Football. If you knew who was going to win, well, why watch?
Totally.
It's not knowing that makes it fun. When people are gambling, right? And so that's play. But if you had intention to play, which play has no intention, if you have intention to play, you get science. And I'd argue you get anything that's creative is play with intention. And
it's interesting because I had a scientist on the show, Donald Hoffman, and he wrote Donald? He wrote a book called The Case Against Reality.
I know of them, yes.
And so what he said is the beauty of science is as soon as it proves something, as soon as it has the certainty of a theory, it does everything that it possibly can to disprove it because it wants to see how to prove it even more. And
the reason is because, there could be many reasons. And first of all, I think from the brain's point of view, that's closure. We love that closure of understanding. And understanding does a number of things as opposed to knowing something. Now, this is semantics maybe, but it's actually one of the reasons why we create our experience, our physical experiences in the world, because we want people to understand it, not know it. I want them to embody it because your brain is embodied. That's how your brain makes meaning in the world. Makes meaning is by physically engaging with the world, right? So with science, especially if you make people part of that process and you make them enact that process, even if they're not consciously aware of it, their body's understanding it. And so we love that closure. But I'd argue that science is actually an iteration to better questions.
Wow.
It's not an iteration to knowing, it's an iteration to not knowing. It's just not knowing more, it's not knowing better and better. It's getting to better and better questions, because finding a good question, that's at the heart of good science.
It's at the heart of everything.
Really hard. Yes, exactly. I'd argue design thinking, which design thinking is effectively empiricism. And so they've sort of co-opted empiricism. Your brain is empirical. In other words, it learns from trial and error. But design thinking begins with a problem, not a bad idea, right? But what happens if you come up with a great solution to that problem, but what if your problem's crap? What if your problem's meaningless?
Yeah.
Well, then what do you have? So really what you want to begin with is a great question, and that's hard to find. And that takes time, and that takes iteration.
Well, in my conversation with Donald Hoffman, it was really interesting because what he spoke about was the fact that, and I think you touch on this too, so I don't want to put words in your mouth and segue where it's not true for me, okay?
Uh-huh.
But in the case against reality, what part of what he says is that we can't deal with reality because in a model of survival of the fittest, I can't start to look of, oh, is that a kind thing to do? Or is that a nice thing to do? Or morally, is that what I want to do? Because I will die by thinking those questions, because one person's just coming at, what do I need to do in order to survive? But if I see all the things out here that make this reality not the world that I want to survive in, I'm going to die. And my species is going to die. So what he says is the brain has become programmed, and I may be misquoting him, but what I understood is the brain has almost programmed itself to say, we can't look at reality because we need to survive. We can't say, is the beast that's chasing us does he have beautiful hair, or do we think that he might fall in love with another beast? We don't have time to think that. We have to protect ourselves. And when I asked them, but hold on, the reality of that is that what we will create from that reality is a world that we don't want to live in. And he said that's a very interesting question, because science is now looking at, how do we look at morality from a scientific point of view?
Mm-hmm.
Because the evolution of a Hitler or somebody like that comes from the thought of, we're just going to survive. We're going to find the most fit species, we're going to put it together, and we're going to dominate. But the reality of what dominates is not anything we're comfortable with, or most of us aren't comfortable with, or some of us aren't comfortable with, some of us are, probably. And so the question is, what world do we create when we live in the world that's created that way? And I want to know sort of what you think on stuff like that, because your perception, what you do with perceptions and what you do with the reality and what you do, the way you talk about reality too, from what I understand. I mean, you're a brilliant man. I wish I could dumb this down like 45 steps, because for most people listening to sort of get a sense on a simple version, where do we sit?
Where do we which?
Where do we sit in the fact that if you tell the common man walking on the street that what they see isn't real, it's just a perception of what's real?
Well, how do I start with that? First of all, I mean, because I start most of my talks in that way, in some sense.
Yeah.
But first of all, the world exists, right? There is a physical world. There is light. Well, actually, there's electromagnetic radiation. Light is defined by the area between 400 and 700 nanometers. In other words, the parts of the spectrum that we're sensitive to. So, in Genesis, it should have said, let there be electromagnetic radiation, not let there be light. But leaving that to one side, the world exists. Okay. The question is, do we see it?
Right.
And the argument is that we don't, right?
Right.
But we see it usefully. We don't see it accurately, we see it usefully. And that's very useful, right? To see it
Right.
useful.
Right.
Because the problem is a couple of things. First of all, we are forever physically separate from that. Our brain is separate from the physical world. Our brain only has access to that world through our senses. For instance, your retina, your eyes, your eardrum, your skin. But take your eyes. The information that's coming in from the world conflates multiple aspects of that world. So something is large and far away will generate the same projection onto your retina, something that's small up close.
Totally.
And the intuitive one is something that's loud and far away will generate the same amplitude of sound as something that's quiet and up close. But your brain has no access to it. All it has access to is the amplitude, right? So it just gets this data. So the data is meaningless in that it literally has no meaning. It could represent multiple things in the world. It could be something large and far away, or loud and far away, or quiet and small up close. It has no way of knowing. What's more, even if it did know, it doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't say, here's this thing, and given this, do that.
Right.
Okay, so it doesn't come with instructions. That's why I say it's meaningless. It's not that it's not useful. It's just not meaningful.
Yeah.
So where does that meaning come from? And where that meaning comes from is we have an access to another set of data, right? Which is history, which is my past interactions with that stuff. And it's how I then respond to that thing that gives it its meaning. It's how I react to it.
Mm-hmm.
So if I pull my hand away, that's pain. That's my response to it. That's the meaning of thing. Pain doesn't exist in the world. There's no such, if we weren't here, pain wouldn't exist. Well, if sentient animals weren't here,
right,
pain wouldn't exist, right? Because pain is a useful perception. It's not an accurate perception, right? It gets us to do something that's useful, right? An orgasm is a useful perception. It gets us to do something that's useful for evolution, to perpetuate tissue. It doesn't exist if sentient systems are not here, right? So that's what I mean. So that's a useful perception. And what's more, because it doesn't come with instructions, and given that the world changes, our brain evolved to adapt, which is why it's very useful that we don't see it accurately.
Yeah.
Because if we did, we would have one perception, but then the world changes. Context is everything.
Love it.
And now your brain can adapt to that because it's constantly re-meaning. It's constantly making new meanings. And it's the meaning that we see. It's not the world we see, it's the meaning. Red is a meaning. Red doesn't exist in the world. Light does. But our perception of it is inside our brain. The red couldn't be closer to you. It's inside your head projected outward.
I love it. So let me twist this a little bit and see if we can come up with something here. In the study of classic Indian philosophy, they talk about four time periods, from the lowest evolution to the highest evolution, and that they move through each other on a cycle, but each one maintains itself. So we have been in the lowest right now in these last 2200, 2400 years, which is how long these periods last, 22 to 2800 years. We have been in a time period called Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is the world of form. It's the world where everything is solid. We are now just about 300 years ago, we now shifted into the next age, which is the age of energy. It's called Dwapara Yuga. And suddenly we're starting to see that the world isn't form anymore. The world is actually energy. And suddenly we're starting, science is starting to come away from its evolutionary theory a little bit and lean into the quantum physics theory, where we are seeing that we are all a part of each other through quantum physics, because we're not if we examine this form in a microscope, we don't see anything that has form. We see swirls of energy. We see atoms and neurons and protons and whatever smart people understand that to be. But we don't see forms built upon forms. We see forms built upon energy. And it's the speed of the light and the movement and the light that it gets that actually creates the physical structure of what we see.
Yep.
So in some ways, everything we see in general right now is a delusion of what actually is, because it's just a made up notion that it's a solid piece of matter. So do the perceptions in the world that you live in the world that you see, do those perceptions over time shift so much that the very foundation of what is believable or is possible shift from form to energy to truth to understanding, or whatever those four ages are? Do you understand what I'm asking you?
I believe so. For me, yes, things are often constantly shifting, whether or not I like it to shift, right? With that said, I mean, I encourage a shift, but also I think that we need a foundation from which to step into uncertainty. So I think you also need certainty from which to step into uncertainty.
Why?
Why? It's a great question. Why? Because I don't have a good answer.
Okay.
But
I love that. Thank you for your honesty.
I like that question. Why? That's my assumption. And as I will tell you in all my talks, everything that we say and do and believe is grounded in our assumptions and biases. So my assumption is that we need a foundation from which to step into for a period of time. It doesn't mean that that foundation can't be changed.
So one of the questions that the Mosaic has asked me is, what if what I believe is no longer true?
Right.
What would I see if I could see what I don't see, which is something else? And so what would happen if that, like, because there's all this talk about certainty and uncertainty and how we hate uncertainty and we love certainty. But what if that's just not true? What if we actually love uncertainty?
Well, we do, actually. We do in certain
situations.
In certain situations. The question is, why don't we engage in that state more often? Why is it the case that more often than not? What if it's more of our world, what world we've created, in which we are biased to not like uncertainty?
Yeah, because we set the rules up. We've set the rules up of our society that uncertainty is scary. So if we set the rules up, our thoughts become our words become our actions become our stories, and our stories become our life. So of course, if we believe that, we're going to try and live a life that doesn't go against that.
For sure.
But so we shift all that.
Well, there is a good reason to not like uncertainty, right? A good reason to not like uncertainty is because you can't predict. And so again, if you can't predict, you die. So there's an element of having to be able to predict. If I don't know where my next step is, if I can't predict whether or not the floor is going to be solid underneath my feet, if I can't predict whether my legs are going to hold my weight, then I can't move. So I have to have some level of certainty about certain things in order to be able to function in the world. So right? That doesn't mean they have to remain solid. But interesting, coming back to your form and energy, and you mentioned about how science has followed this route as well. A suggestion, don't know if this is true, obviously, but a suggestion is that this has also followed the progression of thought, not enough thought. I think it really hasn't really impacted fully yet, but science itself was very reductionist, right? We reduce things to an object. If we wanted to understand something, we had to eliminate all the other compounds and reduce it to a single thing. So it's reductionism, right? Yeah. And that's how we come to understand something. And then we do experiments on it. In other words, we do A/B testing. We say, well, what happens if I do this and not that, and I have one variable, and I start describing the system. The problem with, and reductionist has been very good. It's got us this far in a way, right? It's A equals B equals C type thing. The problem is nature's not like that.
Totally.
There's an aspect of nature that we're enabled to model in that way, but that's not nature itself. That's maybe the form that you're describing. Energy, on the other hand, I would phrase it differently. I mean, not, of course, energy exists, literally, of course. But the way I interpret what you're saying is that it's about interaction. And so the irony is that when we applied reductionist science, what we actually did, especially in biology, we eliminated the very thing that we were studying, which is life. Life is a consequence of the interactions between things. Think about a whirlpool, right? A whirlpool, we all know, is a thing that exists in the world. It's a physical object. It does stuff. A ship can get lost there, right? It's stuff that has impact on the world, and yet a whirlpool doesn't exist on its own. It's a fundamentally emergent consequence of the interaction between water molecules. But if you were to study any one of those water molecules in isolation, you can never predict the whirlpool.
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
You can only understand the whirlpool through interaction. And that's what it is to understand the brain, what it is to be human, what it is to be alive, is interaction. And that's the stage what I would interpret is being called energy, especially when you think about quantum entanglement, etc.
So let me push back a little bit, which is not a pushback.
Good.
It's just ideological.
We only ever learn if we push back. Conflict is beautiful, right? We only learn from conflict.
I believe that. I believe in the end of like-minded community and the beginning of unlike and like-minded community, because that's where real innovation happens in my mind. So
it's the context in which you have the conflict that matters.
It's exactly. So here, my definition of energy comes from a completely different place. Form comes from a place of duality. Energy comes from a place of unity.
Okay.
And when there is no duality and there's only energy, energy is the component that makes everything what it is. It's not separate from anything. So the way you describe it, or I've understood you to describe it, because you're brilliant, and I don't know that I understand everything you're saying, but
I don't know if I understand everything I'm saying.
Okay, so we're in harmony on that. But the way you speak about it, it's still in a world of duality. It's still in that place where Bucky Fuller says.
Understood. Okay, let me rephrase it a bit, because I take your point. It's a very good point. Let me use a different word then. When I talk about interaction, when I talk about what I'm really talking is about integration. So, right. So and in fact, in the States, we've always talked about. I mean, I've spent half my life here, half my life in Europe, but America prides itself on diversity, and that's a wonderful thing. Diversity
used to pride itself on diversity.
The fact that people even have a question about whether or not diversity is a good thing is
crazy.
It's a ridiculous concept from the perspective from biology. Diversity is the engine of evolution, right? A system cannot evolve if it's not diverse. It's what enables a corporation to survive and thrive. It's what enables an individual to thrive. And this is just, in some sense, self-evident, but there's all kinds of work to say that. But what often gets left out in that conversation is integration. Because diversity by itself is complicated. If you had to maintain a diversity of non-integrated elements, that requires a huge amount of energy to keep all those things going in isolation, right? But as soon as you can integrate across that diversity, you now have what's called a complex system. They're integrated. And that's a far more robust, resilient system. That's why I'm talking about interaction. The whirlpool is an integrated system, right? Across, in this case, not diverse molecules, they're all water molecules, but nonetheless, the point's still the same. So in that sense, I think it's more consistent with what you're describing in terms of energy, which is the integration across.
So this interview hasn't gone anywhere like what I thought it was going to go, but I love the way it has gone.
Where did you want it to go?
Oh, no, I wanted it to go exactly where we are, because I think this is absolutely fascinating. And what I would really love is to dialogue with you, and sit with you hundreds of thousands of times and really start to sharpen out some.
That's a long time.
That's a long time. But here's the practical application of what I'm trying to have happen.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm doing with Louis Rosenberg and Unanimous AI, his company, is that he's looked at the way nature operates, and he's looked at specifically the way lesser species have come together to make more intelligent decisions. And he's realized that through the process of swarm, through the process, when you watch a flock of birds fly, there isn't a leader. They somehow come together in a unified mind.
Yes. It's called cellular autonomous. They're called cellular autonomous systems. You can model them in terms of what's called cellular autonomous systems. Yeah.
So that doesn't mean there's not some diversity in that. But what it means is that collectively they take the diversity that's there and they find the way there where there's no diversity, and they all agree to go somewhere. So in the world that we're living in right now, to me, that says what I was trying to say through the mosaic even more than I knew how to say it, because we live in a time of divisiveness and diversity.
Mhm.
And yet there is something inherent in who we all are when you get below the superficial uh, subdividers. I've had the opportunity to sit with some of the most wealthy people in the world as my friends, and to sit with some of the poorest people on street corners and speak to them too.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I've found over the course of time is it doesn't matter what color your skin, what religion you practice, what your education, what border you live behind, what political party you're a part of or not a part of, what religion you practice or ideology you follow. Everybody wants inherently the same thing. We want to be loved and accepted. We want to be understood and validated. And we want our ideas to be acknowledged, and we want to know that we have the right to believe that. No one has ever asked me in the course of my whole 64 years on this planet to believe what they believe. Because as long as I accept and validate them for what they believe, they give me the same right to do that as well.
Mhm.
And so in a world that we're living in now with tremendous diversity, where divisiveness is at an all-time high, where certainty of one cell or silo is conflicting with certainty of another silo, and it's creating gridlock everywhere we turn, not only politically, but medically, education, religion, everywhere we turn, there's this diversity. How do we take these ideas that you're creating? And to me, the thing that I've seen is this concept of swarm, where you put people together and like bees that go out to search for the best place to put a hive, but intellectually they don't have the capacity to come up with a life or death decision on their own. But they all go out and scope out their places, and they come together and they sort of vibrate together like this. And one pushes it this way and one pushes it this way. But when they get to the place where there's no opposition, they go there and they build the hive, and it always works.
Mm.
And so my practical reality is for the everyday people. How do we take what you're doing today and come up with a new way of relating, a new decision-making process, a new way of understanding that the world we look at is not what we see?
Yeah.
And the work that I do, I call it the 359. You know, there's a 360-degree view of the world. We see 1 degree, but we don't see the other 359. And for me, the 359 is what makes the world full.
Mhm.
How do we get people out of that 1% and let them see at least some part of the 360, some part of the 359?
How do we, so there's a lot there, and there's a lot I can speak to with that. One, for instance, is understanding and validating what do they really need, and what's needed in order to facilitate maybe a shift in the way we engage in the world. So to try to put those together, I'd say, first of all, most of our work is really about trying to create doubt. Because if I can create doubt, not by itself, but within a certain kind of environment, trusting environment, for instance, if I can create doubt in the way people see red, then how can they hold so strongly to the way they see another person?
Totally.
If everything that you're doing is grounded in your history, is grounded in your bias and assumptions, most of which you don't even know you have. And it's not that you can step outside them. You can never step outside your bias and assumptions. You always have them. But the first step is to acknowledge that you have them and where they came from. And the second is to then figure out what they are. And usually the best person to figure that out is usually not you, it's usually someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's to question them. But in order to do so, you have to have humility. You have to have the strength and the courage to say, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
The problem is we're educated to know. We're not educated to ask questions. We're educated to have answers. We educate kids to be a sous chef, not a chef, right? Here's the recipe. Here's the stuff. Here's the instructions. Cut it like this. And if you've done it right, the bread will rise, right? And so first of all, we want to create that awareness in how you perceive the world, how and why you perceive what you do. Because once you know that, it almost demands humility when you get into conflict.
Yeah. Yeah.
And right now, when, not right now, but throughout time, we're always in conflict. For me to be in conflict is to engage in a situation that's different from what I expect. I'm now in conflict, right? And often, too often, when we engage in conflict, if you and I are in conflict in the normal way we think about it, my aim is to prove that you're wrong and to shift you towards me. Mm-hmm. And you're trying to do exactly the opposite, prove that I'm wrong and to shift me towards you. Notice that we're set up to win but not learn. My aim is to not move. Your aim is to not move, but to move the other. Violence, you could argue, is to grab you and to pull you towards me, right? And yet, if you don't move, you die.
Totally.
Right? That literally is to not learn. Totally. So it's only through conflict. So how do you confront with that situation? You expand the space of possibility. You enter conflict with a question instead of an answer. You enter the conflict with the desire to understand rather than to know or to convince. Now, I separate understanding from validation. So I personally think people want to feel understood.
Totally.
And to understand, that doesn't mean you have to validate them. And I think by separating them is very useful, because if you separate them, it means you can have a conversation with someone you completely fundamentally disagree with.
All the time.
Right? Because to understand them or to communicate them with not validating, too often we think, oh, that person can't have a voice because if we listen to them, we're validating them. No, no, no. You're trying to understand them, because it's only in understanding them can you ever shift them.
Yeah.
And to understand someone is to understand what their biases and assumptions are.
I love it. And we're playing a little bit semantics, because I think I can validate what you believe is what you believe without validating it as what I believe. And so
well, what I mean by that
is still understanding. So I
understand everyone makes sense to themselves, right? Totally. Just not other people. So if you're doing a behavior that doesn't make sense to me, it's only because it doesn't fit with what I would do given my set of assumptions and biases come from my history, etc. But you make sense to you. So I need to understand why it makes sense to you. Now, in understanding that, now I can say, that makes sense. That's rational. I disagree with your assumptions and biases, so I don't validate those, but I understand you. Because ultimately what we all want to do is feel like we exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even before to feel value, we need to feel like we exist.
I found in the work that I've done and the people that I've met that people just want to be loved and accepted. That's really all.
That is to be loved is one argument is to love is to me to create that space that does. I have 3 children, and my role is in loving them is to not protect them from risks, to enable them to take it.
100%.
It's to be the sandbar that enables them to go out and swim, and when they get tired, they can stand back here. And that is to understand them. Yeah.
So there are a couple places where I would love to further dialogue with you when we have that opportunity, or we might never have it. You might say, this guy's a crazy guy. I want to get rid of him as soon as I possibly can. But to me, the starting ground before we can get to any of that place is that you and I have to establish a basis of trust. That I have to know that I can trust you enough to be vulnerable with you, to let down my guard, to allow you to see, to give up the beliefs that I have that allow me to think that this is who I am, and that I'll be okay with that.
True. But then that system is itself not just, trust is essential. It's interesting to think, what does trust actually mean in that context? But also one must take agency in that trust. And that meaning of your brain, meaning is determined by how you respond to a thing. So I can feel trusted by you, or I can feel distrusted by you. I can feel a sense of trust, not by how I engage with you, and vice versa. So trust also emerges. It's not necessarily to be given to you. You create it mutually through stepping into vulnerability. I think that one of the things that's currently, this is a general statement, and maybe it's 51, I say way back when, but I personally think intimacy is often being lost now.
Yeah, totally.
From privacy.
Yeah.
And so, because it's scary to become dependent on another person. Love is to become suddenly vulnerable to another person. If I give you the freedom, I tell you how I'm feeling. Now, you have room to control me, because now if my feelings are dependent on you, you could just walk away, right? But by holding it, I actually take your freedom away from you because you don't know who you're with.
Yeah.
Right?
So I describe it that we've been hurt so many times. We put silos around ourselves or walls around ourselves. And intimacy, the way it appears in most people's life, is my wall meets your wall. And we think we're being intimate, but we're not being intimate because you don't, I haven't touched you. You haven't touched me. Our walls have connected, but that's nothing. And that's why we leave empty and alone. The other place that I really would like to get to with you and really understand, because to me, this is the most paradigm shift that's important. And it's the shift from duality to unity. It's the shift where there is no you and me. There is only we. There is no sense that of other and somebody to fear. Because what we do together, and the world we create is the world we live in. And to me, the idea of swarm or the mosaic or the idea of what I'm trying to create by bringing people together to be a part of this one thing is the beauty of what happens when we come together and each of us just gives a little bit towards deciding how we live our lives. Mm-hmm. And we're involved in those decisions, and we don't have somebody else make them for us. But that's my thing. Here's what I'd like to do, because I want to honor your time. And as I said to you, I could talk to you for thousands of hours. And I hope one day
I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
One day we'll be able to do that, because I love the brilliance of your mind, and I love your openness. So, but the place that I always close in questioning is, when you look at the world that we live in today, and I know we're a lot further along. We're not tarring and feathering people anymore, allegedly, but you know, we are a little bit further along than we've been. But in the diversity and the hatred and all of the stuff that's going on, is this the world that you always dreamed of handing over to your children and to your children's children?
Of course, no.
Okay.
There are aspects, of course, is very much yes, but something happened today, actually. It was remarkable. Of course, we all know about what's happening with kick them out or leave.
Yeah.
Go home.
Send them back.
Send them back. And what's remarkable in a negative sense about that is not only is this person who's supposed to be leading doing this, but it's a number of people who are so easily able to follow it.
Yeah.
That's one. And then I was on the phone today with a phone call, and I was asking this, it was an administrative call, and the person, it was some department. I said, what actually is this department? I don't understand what this department is. And the person repeated the words. And I said, I understand the words. I'm just wondering, I don't get what this department is for. And they shouted it, and for some reason they thought I'm English. I'm not. I brought up in the States, but it doesn't matter. The point is, they assumed I was from somewhere else. And he adopted an English accent, and a very bad one as well. And he said, he shouted, if you can't understand these words, you should go home.
Wow.
You should leave.
Wow.
Right? I've never had that exchange before.
Wow.
Until today, on the back of what's just happened.
Yeah.
And I found it really, obviously it was incredibly troubling and devastating. But what was particularly powerful is thinking that my kids will have to possibly hear that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my kids are incredibly kind children. They're kind people. They're not children, people. And that was, for me, the most important attribute that they would have. And of course, the person who's shouting that thinks they're actually doing something good.
Yeah.
That's the challenge there, right? Among many others. But so I didn't think that's an awful thought. And so it almost makes you want to just throw up your hands. On the other hand, it makes you want to just move forward as well.
So with that being said, that it's not the world, and I want to tell you a story after this question, and we'll close with that, and you can comment on it however you want to do it. With that being said, if we continue going in the way we're going with the certainty that we have or uncertainty that we have, the situation is not going to get different. It's going to just continue. The momentum is going to grow, and we're going to continue to get to the place where we look like we're heading. So if you had one thing to say to people from the work you're doing, from your personal life, from everything that you know, if you could share just one thing without anger, just with your heart open, what would you say to people that might help them get from where we are in the world today to the world that you would like to give over to your children and your children's children, what would be one thing you would do to get it started?
To get it started, what would I say? To get it started is what we're trying to do in our own modest way. What I would like to say, actually, I don't really, in some sense, I know and I don't know. So my knee-jerk response is, with so much focus on self, and we think even people who are trying to improve themselves and trying really hard to improve themselves, my suggestion is be the sandbar for someone else. Enable someone else to step into uncertainty. Enable someone else to take the risk. Be that place that someone else can come back to. And a dear friend of mine, Dwayne Michaels, probably one of the world's greatest living photographers. I have breakfast with him every 3 weeks or so. I had breakfast with him this morning, and he gave me a wonderful quote. Well, it wasn't a quote, it's just how he feels, which he says, it's not quite, I didn't agree exactly, but it's, I've never been so happy as when I've been most loving, as opposed to when I was most loved.
Yes, yes.
And we all want to feel loved, of course, but what if we actually attempt to be more loving?
I love it.
Be the sandbar and to just try to enter conflict with a question, with the desire to understand. It doesn't mean you have to agree.
Yeah.
But just to understand.
I love that. And it so blends into the story that I've just been feeling to share with you. And I just want to share it with you, just one, so you know a little bit more about me and my life, and two, just because it's been one of my greatest teachers in my life. I have the honor and privilege of having a 29-year-old developmentally delayed daughter. And she unfortunately or fortunately doesn't have the ability to have conversation like this. The conversations we have, if I even understand what she's saying, are around very primary basic human needs. I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm whatever, I want sushi, I want whatever she wants to say, right? But over 29 years, I've started to get to know her a little bit. And most of the time when she speaks about something, I have a fairly good idea what she means. And I'm so happy about that because I know how important it is for her to be understood.
She exists.
To exist. But sometimes I just can't understand her. And I'll ask her, can you please repeat it? And she'll try again, and I still don't understand her. And when she tries and I don't understand her, she'll raise her voice. And she'll say it louder. Well, it wasn't because I couldn't hear her. It was because I just couldn't understand the context and the words. But she doesn't get that. And so when she screams and yells and I still don't get it, then she goes into a tantrum. And she tantrums and tantrums, and it can be, mind-boggling for me because we're in the middle of somewhere, and she's just trying so hard to get herself heard and understood, and she is so frustrated she throws a tantrum. And when that still doesn't work, she'll come at me and try and run at me and rip my shirt or bite me or do something because she's just so freaking frustrated. And this happened for years. I mean, she's 29 years old. Her mom passed away 18 years ago. I remarried and we're together, but still she was trying desperately to tell me something. So after a long time, I said, maybe, Elisa, are you trying to say something to me that I don't understand? And in the middle of her rage, she started to just laugh. And she went, yes, Daddy. Perfect English. And I said, so when I don't understand you, you don't have it, you don't know how much that hurts me because I want more than anything to get what you're saying. But when I don't understand you, are you trying to communicate to me in a way that I don't understand? And her rage turned into this incredible Buddha-like belly laugh that was just, anybody listening to it would have just melted and just thought, oh my God, this is the happiest kid I ever saw. And I said, Elisa, how are you trying to do that? And for people who aren't seeing this as a video, she just put her finger to her head. And I said, you little son of a gun, are you trying to put thoughts into my head? And she went, yes, Daddy, yes. And she just started laughing because she was all this time putting thoughts in my head because she couldn't communicate, but she could easily put them into my head through telepathy because that's a skill that she had. But I wasn't listening. And you know, from the time that I started to listen, there have been no more tantrums. Occasionally, I still don't hear it, and occasionally we'll see it building up, but then we know the process and we say, okay, I'm listening, try and tell me. But here's the thing. What she taught me in that moment is that everybody I know works with that same pattern. When they speak and they don't get heard, they yell. When they yell and they don't get heard, they create a scene. When they create a scene and they don't get heard, they try and destroy something. And so it's the simplest strategy in the whole world to just listen to people. And I get when you are asked, when you're saying just ask a question, it isn't even, it is the question. But the question is just is serving up the opportunity to listen to what the answer is. And I think if we would spend more time listening, because those people that are saying, send her back, send their back, they're just like my daughter, they're having a tantrum. Yeah. But what happens is we get so caught up in the incident and in the words and in the vial that we don't have the compassion to say, hold it. Tell me what you're really saying. Like what got to this point? And that's the world that I want to create through this mosaic swarm that I want to do. And I would love to, under separate cover, sit with you and engage you in some of this to see if it's something you feel. Because to me, the world is one step away. The beauty of a mosaic is one piece away from where we are, one connection away is an entirely different world. We're not that far off.
No.
We just are stuck in the connections that bind us.
That's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing. And yes, I would love to carry on, and I feel very positively about it, obviously, about this whole endeavor. And with the intention of engaging with compassion and courage, but also certain expectation as well.
Yeah.
Gracefulness. So, but yeah, wonderful.
I want to thank you again for taking the time to give to us, now a little over an hour of time. And I know how busy you are. I know how much the world wants you. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending this time together. And let's make this a beginning if we can, because there's so much that I believe together we can accomplish more than we can individually. And all the success you've had, now let's amplify that with more and more and more people doing things that are of not of like mind, of unlike mind.
Well,
that bring
for us,
similar
we're just misfits. We're just trying to increase the community of misfits.
Yeah, I love that, and I'm clearly one. Look at me, right?
Well, misfits for us, misfit is not someone who doesn't fit anywhere. It's because they fit in many places.
I love that. I love that. I love that. All right, will you just let people know before we get off how they can reach you, what you're working on, what is something that you would like them to be involved in? How can they find you? What do you need from people?
Well, we of course have a website, labofmisfits.com, and I have a book that recently came out called Deviate, The Science of Seeing Differently. And we have another TED Talk that's coming out soon on the power of awe and wonder. And we also create physical experiments in the world as experience. We turn my lab into a nightclub and things. And so people are invited and take part in that space. And we're actually conducting experiments. We just finished one on tolerance and intolerance, and how can we measure and facilitate toleration as a step towards openness. And we're actually engaged right now in a series of experiments on anger.
Wow.
And the power of actually being there for others in anger.
Love it.
What happens in your brain, what happens to what are the consequences of it? So, and eventually people will be able to come to the space and better learn about themselves.
When we have that opportunity to talk, what you're doing is what I want to do, and I want to help you in whatever way I can.
Oh, thank you very much.
Because it so coincides with what I want to create with these mosaic chat rooms and these ways of for people to come together. And I would love to see how we can participate together with you and do that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again for all your time. Big love.
All the best.
Until soon.
All right. Ciao.
Okay. Ciao.